We are live. Mark and Ellie, turn off your cameras so we don't have you on screen.
Hi.
Let's see. How do we get Ellie and Morgan to not be on our screen?
I don't see them, but that's just
Okay. Okay.
you gotta love you've just gotta love the Facebook vagaries, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
so
Well, and we're old timers, so for us to figure out any technology is like its own kind of miracle. So,
yeah. Well, and I haven't been on a Zoom to Facebook in a long time since I lost Amlamont for the Blaze. But anyway, hello everybody. I am Jenna Blum. I am the CEO of Mighty Blaze. I interview authors for fun, not for profit. And I'm so thrilled to be here tonight with Sean Murphy, who is my brother from another mother and the founder of 1455 Literary Arts, which is an amazing literary community. And I assume many of you already know about that and are here because of 1455. Sean is also, as anybody who knows him understands, like the menschiest person in the whole world. He is an ubermensch. Like he is the nicest, like a human ray of sunshine, like a human crepuscular ray. And he is also the author of This Kind of Man. So that is what we are here to talk about tonight is his brand new book. So welcome. Can you show us your book, please?
well, yes, but first order of business, let me properly. So, Jenna is not only
What
a
now?
dear friend. She's a brilliant writer, um, New York Times bestseller. She has Those Who Save Us, which I just have to show. Like this is an original note dated 2004, but I first read this in 2003 on a Word doc. So we go way back. But I've been following her career as a writer, and she mentioned Mighty Blaze. Jenna is the gold standard of literary activism and as a literary citizen. So, in addition to being a dear friend, she always shows up for writers. She's always said yes whenever I've asked her anything. So, she's a personal hero and a dear friend. So, Jenna, I'm so grateful that you're here. I wouldn't want to celebrate this moment with anybody else.
Same and happy launch eve to you, my friend. So proud of
Thank
you.
you, thank you, thank you.
You've been
So,
around for a long time. Yes, hold up that beautiful book right to the camera so we can all see it. I'm obsessed with this cover and have questions about it.
okay, well, we're here to talk about it. So, as I said at the outset, I am at your service. This is not our first rodeo, but it's been a while, I think, since you've been asking the question. So, I'm excited and nervous.
You should be so nervous talking to me. Everybody should be deeply unsettled talking to me. Really, I just want to know about your book because I know you as a poet, and I know this is a departure. I want to know about toxic masculinity, although many of us probably feel we know way too much about that, and then how one remains a good man in this challenging world. But first, can you please introduce your new book to us? Tell us what This Kind of Man is about.
Absolutely. Thank you for asking. So, you know me, and anyone that knows what I do, like I definitely wear, I won't say I wear any of them particularly well, but like I've written a bunch of poetry. I've written tons of music and movie criticism. I've written a lot about politics over the years. I've written fiction, but I had written a lot of political commentary just because I'm a political junkie.
Mhm.
Um, and certainly, in 15, 16, and even into 17, I was like so many of us trying to make sense of kind of the insanity that overtook America. And what I was finding is the more I had to say, the less I wanted to write about it in nonfiction. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. One, that the ground is pretty well covered. There are people that's their beat and they do it really well. But what I started realizing is as I got more curious and frustrated and you know fired up, I found that talking about it unimaginatively, there's like a shelf life. Even if you write the most well-researched essay, there's something about political commentary that's like newsy and it's of the moment. And a week later, there's a new outrage and there's a new. So I started thinking deeply about, Trump didn't just come out of nowhere and MAGA didn't just kind of formulate overnight. We can think about George Wallace and the demagoguery that's always appealed to certain sectors of America. So when I started thinking about that, I started thinking, the big question, and I talk about this a lot the promo stuff, is the central question to me seems to be everyone's pissed off right now. And there's a lot of good reasons for it. But when we think it, when we narrow in on that, it's like the men are really mad and the men are happy to try to articulate why they're mad. And I wanted to kind of peel back the layers and go, what's everyone upset about? And
Mm.
are there some satisfactory answers that go beyond, well, people in red states are racist. They don't like the elites. We're never going to come together. And so, until we have another Obama or whomever, we're never going to, unite around a charismatic leader. So my feeling is that, and we can talk about this more, but there are systemic causes in America that I think are more related to class, misogyny, racism. There are issues we're still working through. We have a lot of work to do. There's no question about that. But thinking about class issues and why a lot of people are in a system that they feel that they can't win in leads to a lot of this frustration. So I started thinking about it creatively and started writing some short stories. And that's when I realized I might have a collection that cohesed around that issue.
Really interesting. Why do you think the men are so mad? Because I know a lot of women who are mad, especially as our rights seem to be being sent backward to a different century, and in fact are in many places, and it might not stop there. Why do you think the men are so mad? And do you think, I shouldn't be asking two questions at once, but bouncing off what you just said, do you think that it's the men of a certain class that are mad, or do you think that men are mad in all of our classes across the board? And I know America's supposed to be classless. We're totally not classless. I
Right.
mean, I might be like classless, but you know what I mean. Like, we definitely have a class system.
Yeah, I think I, oop, okay. Um I just so let me see, let me make sure that we are on Facebook
Okay.
because I'm getting and we can now it says stop live stream. All right, we're good. Um Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and I don't think I'm qualified to answer that. I think there's a lot of answers, but one of the things that this book tries to deal with, Jenna, is I think, and again, to our generation and the subsequent, the millennials and the Z's, they understand this, but I think we're in this kind of crossfire of we now know that a lot of our received notions of masculinity are toxic, are dysfunctional, are totally outmoded. But the older generation, I have a certain empathy that I might not have had 10 or 15 years ago for men that were born into this notion of you got to be tough,
Mhm.
feelings are for sissies, you got to handle your business. Empathy is weakness, competition is everything. And now these people have tried to, whether it's reading their bibles, never having a sick day at work, like they've lived according to what they were taught and what was inculcated, like this is how you be a good American. And now they're told you're a dinosaur, you're a racist, you're sexist, you're useless. And a lot of these men that have retired now feel, I think, used up and spit out.
Mm.
And they're like, I've tried to be a good person and now I'm being told that I'm the devil.
Mm.
There's no excusing violence, aggression, racism, sexism. But I think it goes a little bit deeper than, yeah, well, a lot of these old men are just, angry dudes that hate women. And it's like, I think they feel inarticulate and it's because they never had an opportunity to develop those feelings. So we've got that going up against this newer generation that I think has a tremendous amount of empathy, an admirable amount of sensitivity, but there's a fragility because now with social media, we're measuring each other in different ways and everything's an argument. And this whole notion of zero sum game, whether it's in the professional world or social media world, everyone's trying to win. You're trying to win the soundbite. You're trying to win the election, trying to win, promoting your book, whatever it is. So I think that puts people at odds. So I don't think that explains the anger, but again, I think it goes deeper than just, yeah, people are angry because the world's messed up or everyone's woke now. So this is legit pushback. I think there's a lot of people that feel no one's listening to them. And it's weird because everyone's yelling right now.
Right. But the more people yell, the less anybody can hear anybody because it's just sound and fury signifying nothing. Right.
Yeah.
It's really interesting what you're saying. It reminds me of a book I just read. I interviewed Kristen Hanna recently, which is such a great privilege. And she wrote a book called The Women about the female nurses of Vietnam who came home and were told that their service had not existed alongside their male counterparts who went to war thinking that they were being, quote, good Americans, right? They were fighting the wars like their dads had fought war and grandfathers had fought wars. And when they came home, the tide of popular opinion had shifted against them so that people were spitting on them and calling them baby killers. And so not only were they traumatized, but they also were demonized. And I feel like, in some way, what you're saying is that there are in the older generation, sort of just like people feeling demonized for being themselves or doing what they thought were right in the first place. Do you think, and I have, friends who are male friends who are in their 60s and early 70s, and there is this sort of caution about it. Like, are we allowed to say this anymore? Or can I say my dear? Or can I hold a door for you? Will you hit me in the head with a 2x4? Will you flip me out if I step on the outside of the curb so you don't get splashed by a car? Like, so I think people are just very cautious about
Yeah.
what they can and can't do. But those are like the more conscientious men. Is that the kind of mindset that you're talking about? And do you have a story that speaks to that in this collection?
Yeah, it is a great question, and I think there's a lot there. I guess I tend to think that on those issues, some of that is generational backlash that we work through every generation. Like, all the old dudes sit on the proverbial lawn and yell at the kids, and the world, these youngins are crazy or they're lazy. Dad, you're so old fashioned. I think we can continue to work through that. I think where my empathy extends and what I wanted to take a little bit deeper look at is, the reality that what we've seen over the last, several decades is that there's unquestionably been a societal shift where a lot of the money has circulated to the top. So we see like CEOs used to make, say, 100 times what the lowest, earning employee made. Now it's like, 1 million times. So people, jobs are being put overseas. People are, social welfare programs are being dismantled. There's less security, there's less stability, and the best playbook that a certain political party uses is, we'll make sure the people, the have-nots, all fight against each other. So let's make sure there's cultural outrage. Let's make sure we blame the illegal immigrants. Let's make sure we blame woke people and keep people fighting culture wars so they don't pay attention to the fact that there's a Wall Street meltdown that was totally predictable and totally illegal. Taxpayers bailed them out, and they're making more money than ever. And people are losing their jobs overseas, but somehow we're not uniting as workers and organizing. And I think that that's the result of a very intentional and effective political mechanism. So I think a lot of the anger, I guess what I'm trying to do with this book is look at the fact that some of this anger is very warranted. It's filtering out where we're fighting with each other. And I don't think that's an accident. So am I saying there's anything we can do about that? I think long term we can, but we have to understand that better. And I'm not seeing that explained satisfactorily in the media or even in a lot of the creative works that I've seen in the last 10 years.
It's such a fraught topic to wade into toxic masculinity. Like, it's its own hashtag, obviously. I know that you came to this book, as all of us hopefully do when we write a book, like tugged by your own sense of necessity, like tugged into it by a sense of emotional necessity. Did you feel once you started writing the stories like you had some sort of, I guess, hangover from it? I mean, because it's such a difficult topic.
It's fascinating, right? And I'd be curious what your thoughts are too. I tend to, like, even with my poetry, I have friends that'll come to me and be like, "Man, that's really heavy. Is that like really depressing?" And there's something very cathartic about confronting a darkness in writing, especially. I think you get out the other side because what I think what we're trying to do through fiction, right, is we're trying to get inside the skin and inside these characters. So it's you have to embrace kind of the darkness to get in there. But once you're in there, there somehow is a catharsis by I'm trying to not sound pretentious, but th whether they're imagined characters or they spring from, some part of one's life that you've heard a story or you're trying to relate something that you've seen or heard or something that outraged you, you are giving voice, however effectively, to someone or something that didn't or wouldn't speak up for itself. So I find that to be an act that kind of redeems the darkness. So for me, writing these stories, it to me, and maybe this is like my Irish cynicism, to try to focus on the positive would depress me by embracing like people are upset. Let's try to understand where that's coming from. Let's try to help. Let's try to tell stories. Let's try to cultivate empathy and positive dialogue in any way we can. To me, there's a light in that effort. So for me, these stories are pretty heavy, but it's an attempt to say, we can't just cover up the whole 20th century and say some of these men fought wars, they provided for their families. Great job, we got it from now. Like we need to try to understand the continuum of we're all changing, and jokes that we find funny today 30 years from now are not going to be politically correct. And so I think there's some humility that we need to have as the current kind of you know stakeholders in cultural dialogue.
Can you describe what the spectrum and scope of the stories is in the book? And I will preface that by saying one thing that authors have a really hard time doing most of the time is actually talking about the content of their books. So I'm going to like hold your feet to the fire there. Like we love to talk about how we wrote the books and why we
Yeah.
wrote the books and just about everything but what's in the book. But I want your audience to know and to have a sort of calling card to the spectrum of stories that you've created here. So can you give us this sort of a Reader's Digest pitch about the stories?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I appreciate you asking it, and you're right. It's odd, right? Like I
Yeah,
think
you would
writers,
think it's just like these are our babies. So we should be like, oh my God, look at my baby. It's so beautiful. Today she's wearing this and he looks like that. He can tap dance. But I mean, people usually answer that question by like, again, talking about process. So I'm like, Sean,
yeah.
tell us about the book. Tell us about the book. We
How
want to
many writers can say they're at a party or whatever, and it's like, "What's your book about?" And it's kind of like, how can you not know that answer? But
so hard though, that elevator. I actually make my novelists in my workshop rehearse that question. Like they have to give an elevator pitch. And if I had an actual elevator to put them in, I would put them in it and make them ride from the first floor to the 10th. And that's all the time you get, but you have to sell that book. So sell us your book.
So I would say the impetus of these stories, and it's a really interesting paradox. And I'm catching myself saying it, but it's like I would say with maybe one or two exceptions, there's almost nothing true in any of these stories. It's not thinly veiled autobiography, but I know these characters, and I don't mean that in the writerly, like I know these people that I created. These are springing from, I consider it the good fortune of having a somewhat interesting life in that I worked in the service industry for years. I was in part of the dot-com boom and bust. I worked in the tech industry and saw a lot of kind of the not only the innovation and how like these things, over the course of a decade went from, you know, becoming what they are. I've traced kind of the cultural evolution of America through my professional career and then running a nonprofit and being a writer. So whether it's like bosses I've had or coaches that I had, priests that said mass when I was a kid, teachers, the whole gamut, like I've known these people. And so in this book, they've been springboards for people that I feel need to be acknowledged, or especially the people that I've purposefully not emulated. The coaches and men and bosses that have been in my world, or frankly, some of my acquaintances. I hesitate to say friends because I don't think I'm actively friends with anyone that is racist or outwardly toxic, but some of my friends that are maybe less evolved, or I go back a long ways with, all of these people are filtering in. So, I mean, I do worry a little bit. Like, there's a lot of dads in this book, and my dad's still with us. And, he knows, and everyone that knows me and knows my relationship with him, my kind of inoculation against that is I truly don't believe if you have the kind of father that is described in this book, you can't write a book like this because you're writing your own memoir about you're horrible. You're writing The Great Santini or Prince of Tides. So the elevator pitch is really it's giving voice to a type of man that is by essentially inarticulate. So this is, getting inside the head of a man that maybe is looking at his dying wife and inexplicably feels envy because he looks at someone and says, she's had real relationships. She's been able to tell our kids or her friends how she feels. And I've never been, why can't I say I love you? And these men that are struggling, again, like I said at the outset, I a lot of these people have made their own, graves, so to speak. But I have a tremendous empathy for anyone that just hasn't been taught. They weren't modeled the way our generation was better modeled. And certainly the subsequent, like all my friends' kids now have a tremendous empathy, have tremendous sensitivity. That wasn't part of the way the world was, certainly in America 50 years ago. So I think there's this rage and inarticulateness, and I just feel a tremendous pity for that.
It's like About Schmidt, which was this amazing Alexander Payne movie based
Yeah.
on a novel by Louis Begley, very different from book to movie. But I remember being so struck by the movie version of About Schmidt because Schmidt is a prototype of a dude I recognize very well, who's a Midwestern guy. My
Yeah.
mom's family is all from the Midwest, and who is pretty much silent most of the time and like cracks little jokes when he is called upon to make small talk, and has worked in one place his whole life, and his wife has done all of their socializing for them, and like what happens when his wife is no longer there to do that.
Yeah.
And what kind of like sort of emotional awakening can a character like Schmidt have when he is at retirement age? And so I feel like that sort of inchoate rage or the inability toward expression is maybe a prototype that a lot of us recognize, whether we do because we grew up with it, or it's our dads, or it was our grandparents. Certainly, I've always been fascinated by the shifting definitions of masculinity from my dad's era to my grandfather's. My grandfather was like the Jewish Hemingway. Like he went deep sea fishing and he hunted and he was a photographer. But he was also somebody who drank a lot and was a total bully. He was like
Right.
a Spiegmacher, a philanthropist, a lawyer who pulled himself up by his bootstraps, big personality, but also, really bullying. And my dad was like Ferdinand the Bull who just wanted to smell the flowers, like very, very smart, very gentle, very wry. Two equally masculine men in my mind, but their society would have told them differently at the time. So, what is your definition now of masculinity? I know it's a very broad question, but like for you, what constitutes
Yeah.
ideal masculinity?
So for me, I of course, I mean, I have to locate myself at some point as a straight white male, which comes with, one recognizes one's privilege, one recognizes, and I think most writers, I think most artists are just aware of the advantage to even have the opportunity to create art. That is a privilege because that just means you're not working in a coal mine, probably, or you're not working 80 hours a week. So there's the start. I think a lot of the received notions of femininity and masculinity are always very complicated, usually very cynical, very baked into how we can sell things. So, we've adequately, well, maybe we haven't adequately, but I would say we have spent time, still have a lot of work to do, but the fact that women now still have body image issues directly because of how women's bodies are messaged in, everything from magazines to movies. We fetishize anorexia through, models in Victoria's Secret. Similarly, we've been talking about men, as macho, and whether it's in a movie or a book or the media. So I think anything that's already constructed is suspect. I think authenticity, and it's hard, right? I think it's ephemeral, but if you're authentic, if you are naturally sensitive, you should be encouraged to be that guy. I don't think it ever hurts to be more sensitive so we can inculcate in coming generations like being kind is strength. Might does not make right. And I think when we talk about good stories and how to shift the narrative, and what this book sort of tries to do, I hope succeeds at, is show and don't tell that when might makes right, even if you win in kind of the Gordon Gekko sense, like, well,
Mhm.
it's a zero-sum game. Someone has to win, someone has to lose. That's a very American pathology. The reality is, we look at someone like Elon Musk or Donald Trump or whomever, insert name of CEO, they're generally miserable. They can't burn all the money that they've made, and they can't figure out, why am I not happy? And it's like, because you don't have authentic relationships. Your relationships are transactional. All of these things are toxic. And so we need to unpackage that. And I'd be remiss if I didn't add, because I think I've maybe spent a little bit too much time showing my empathy for the old, the old school. I think we also need to be really cognizant of, there is a very dedicated, well-financed, deeply cynical effort from the influencers to make sure that the proverbial dude, the incels in their basements, are alienated, angry, buying firearms, hating women, blaming everything but themselves for the fact that they can't get dates, or they hate themselves, or they feel alienated from society. The fact that there are people like Joe Rogan and Andrew Tate and some of these other, names, one need only go on social media to see the avatars of reclaiming masculinity. Not only is that completely backwards, and I think many of us can see through that, if they were doing it from a sense of genuine conviction, I'd feel kind of bemused and say, we've just got to keep telling better stories. But these people are making money off this. So it's a deeply cynical and very dangerous movement to take these lost males and give them a cause to rally around. It's like rallying around maleness. What's the war? What are the goals? What are you winning? And if the goal is ultimately, you're still going to be alone in your basement, but you got your bros online. The person that's losing in that, right, are the poor souls that flock to these fake prophets.
It's like the island of lost boys, except they're each their own island in their basements, which is really sad. I think about this a lot. I think about like a sort of toxic masculinity thing. And I used to think, oh, like what explains the rise of sort of a demagogue? And is it because there are a lot of lost boys out there in their basements who want something to believe in? And is it because there are a lot of men who quietly have made a lot of money and want to hold on to that money no matter what at the cost of human beings, just because that gives them their identity? And now I almost think that the rise of a demagogue is going to happen anyway. And all of these things key neatly into that movement. That's my own cynicism, maybe, but I think all of those channels are already there. And what you're doing so skillfully is exploring them, one by one, and sort of like lifting up the cover and saying, well, what is under here, and what is under here, and what is under here.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I first of all, you bring up a really good point, Jenna, that we also, I think, we're making a mistake if we don't acknowledge that, whether it's, and we have to, I mean, how can we go an hour in any conversation without mentioning Hitler or Nazis? But like, this is not just an American phenomenon. There is a kind of a world historic tendency, but I think that's why I bring it back to class, in the sense of, when people feel unheard, or times are tough and people are struggling, they're more susceptible to someone, the strong man or strong woman that says, I know what's wrong and I'll make it all right. What we need to do better, I think, as artists and advocates, is tell stories that connect the dots, and try to make an attempt. I have a very unpopular opinion, but I feel very strongly about it. I mean, to really get political for a second, I remember thinking, in the aftermath, when the Wall Street, the 09, 08 debacle was unfolding, I remember thinking, whether this was naive or hopelessly optimistic, that Obama and his team had a once in a generation opportunity to step in and reclaim the narrative and say, this is why government is important. We need
Mm.
guardrails. We need to look out for all of you hardworking Americans that have no business bailing out these scumbags that ran fast and loose with the law. But there was no real effort to engage on that. And I think that anger created a vacuum, and a very cynical movement called at the time the Tea Party moved in and said, people are really mad. If we actually turn this around and go, it's because government's broken. It worked, and it always works. So people feel checked out. They don't want to vote, and they say, well, no one cares about me. And that's not to say that the Democrats are doing all the right things, but when people have their jobs outsourced and can't afford medications that they need to live and are attracted to someone like Trump, again, I'm not satisfied saying, well, yeah, because they're racist and they're dumb. We can't help them. I think for the sake of our country, we need to try harder to complicate how these stories are typically told by the media. I don't want to see another story of a dude in a diner in Iowa saying, well, they're all messed up. Like, we've seen that. We've heard that guy. Let's get a little deeper into coal country and go into Appalachia and see what these communities devastated by opioids look like, and start putting some pieces together in terms of accountability for the powerful corporations that have done this and are somehow not accountable.
One of my favorite storytellers is Heather Cox Richardson, who is a historian who does a daily column called Letters to an American. And she takes the day's news and collates it into a cohesive format. So you sort of get, what happened yesterday or what happened today. And then she places it in historical context, in American historical context, which I find sometimes very comforting and sometimes very frightening. And she has been shining a flashlight lately on the fact that the media has been covering America in a mostly negative light. Like, how badly we're doing is mentioned 87 times yesterday in the popular media, but the fact that the unions have been actually enjoying a robust comeback over the last month, thanks to Biden, that has rarely seen it all, because it's boring. It's like there's unions, and then there's like death by nuclear weapon, or climate change or whatever. So
Right.
I think like the shifting of narrative seems very important to me, even if as a writer, I personally find a happy narrative to be a boring narrative. Like, if we all wrote happy books, the books would be very short. Once upon a time, there was a happy family at the end. So that's it. There's no conflict, therefore there's no drama. It makes sense why, if you're not a journalist, because journalists are very astute with facts, have to be very wedded to fact. But if you're in like the popular media outside of journalism, if you're in opinion journalism, of
Yeah.
course, you're going to maybe doomsay a little bit more, because saying like things are good, our inflation's down, the unions are growing stronger, like that's not fun. So talk to me about how you're hoping with this collection of stories to change the narrative and change the thinking a little bit about masculinity in this country in this moment.
Well, thank you for asking that. And by what everything you just said, chef's kiss. I think I mean, and Heather Cox Richardson is a national treasure. I mean, no false modesty. Like, it's a book. I don't have any illusions. Like, people read this book, they're gonna figure, I just think it's an attempt to dramatize. I think, the stories that I read, and I think you made a really excellent point. Like, journalism is shackled to, they can't get inside the skin necessarily, or it's not their place to imagine or show the inner life necessarily. So when we dramatize these things, I'm hoping that kind of the cumulative effect of some of these stories is not just describing these scenarios of these desperate, kind of scared, angry, alienated men, but when the reader reads how unhappy they are, it does cultivate some empathy, and it gives us an opportunity to say, how could we engage with someone like that, or how could we shine a light the way you're talking about? How can we find ways to emphasize the positive, or model better masculinity? I mean, so for instance, I think about, Bobby Knight, very famous basketball coach that died last year. I never liked him because he was the quintessential 20th century, like, bully, blow hard, my way or the highway. But when he gets results, I think his life is a microcosm. It's on a similar track of a Trump, but Bobby Knight got to a point where he was out of fashion. My, I don't think, cynical take is, if he had a winning program, his buffoonishness, his boorishness would have been tolerated longer than it was. It was really when he stopped winning that suddenly people were like, we can't have a guy cursing at female students. I almost think we gave ourselves too much credit. Like, whoa, that kind of behavior is not tolerated. I've worked at companies where there's male CEOs that get away with outrageous abuse, but because they're powerful. So we need to find ways to show that no one is happy in situations where men are acting toxically. But I think it starts with the stories, and then we need to make those connections culturally and politically, because to affect change, I don't think my book can do it, but I know what isn't working is what we've been trying since 2015 and saying, but look at Trump or look at MTG or insert name of the outrage of the day and say, can't we see through that? It's sad that enough people don't see through it, and that's a whole other topic. But the fact that some people are attracted to that, I think it's in our own best interest to try to analyze, like, what is it about someone that can appeal on any level. And I think the root cause of that is because when we have these inherited notions of masculinity and toughness and what it means to be an American, it's a dead end from the start, and we need to deconstruct that and really powerfully point out you're playing for the wrong team, you're rooting for the wrong, king, and you're going to end up unhappy if you follow that path.
It's like the masculine version of haves and have nots. Like, I feel like that's probably the key. And also, if there is a time that could emphasize the importance of stories more, I don't know what it is, because I feel as though this whole country became divided on the basis of story. It's just the stories were in our social media feeds instead of in books. So people aren't looking at them as stories, but they're absolutely stories. They're called Instagram stories, they're TikTok stories. Like, this is the main musculature driving people's opinions right now, are all these stories on social. And I think that if you ever also needed a better example, the Me Too movement, started with a story and became a movement. So anybody's book or anybody's point of view can be a flashpoint for anything. And I think as writers, it's true. And you're like, I'm just nosing the peanut forward a little bit to the extent that I can. But if you don't, then who is going to do that? And it's really important to do this and to lend your artistry and your craftsmanship and your hard work and your time to expressing an idea that might change the world, and you hope it does, and you just never know. Like, the
Yeah.
outcome's not up to us, but the work is. So would you give us the pleasure of reading an excerpt?
I'd be delighted to. And in fact, it's the story that kicks off the book. Um, I have no editorial comment other than sometimes you do have to trust. I think you and we have done and always can talk about craft. I think we're just junkies for all aspects of craft and comparing notes. I don't think there's ever a right way. Some stories come easier than others. Some poems seem to write themselves. I think writers, we instinctively don't trust when things come easily, but for whatever it's worth, this very short story came out like in one sitting. And to this day, I think this epitomizes this is not me hardly talking at all. It's definitely not my dad, but I think it's proof that as writers, or even as just as human beings, over the course of a lifetime, we're flypaper for sentiment. So every article I've written, every movie I've seen, every horrible or brilliant editorial about where we are as Americans and human beings somehow filtered into this. So it's very tongue in cheek, but it's also, I think, a tone setter of how are the older generations perceiving the younger generations, and how by examining their attitudes do we understand ourselves better. So
Mm,
there
that.
was no so there was no there was this there was no motivation this story pulled out of me, but it was one of the first ones written, and I think it did make me realize I might need to explore this a little more deeply. So it starts the book for a reason, and it's called The Letter My Father Never Wrote Me.
Mm,
Listen, son, you have to understand. Everything was different, and everything's the same. That's the secret of life. It takes most people their entire lives to learn it. Most people never do. Actually, it isn't the secret of life. It's the secret to dealing with the fact that we'll never understand anything. My advice is simple. Don't worry about it. When it's all over, either everything will be explained to us or nothing happens at all. Either way, we're covered. We smoked in movie theaters when I was growing up. You can't do that now. For one thing, no one smokes. For another, no one goes to movies anymore. Can you imagine the sissies of your generation smoking on an airplane? Can you imagine a new mother today if someone lit up next to her? Did you know lawsuits used to be a last resort? Can you imagine eating red meat at least once a day? Can you imagine not counting the cocktails you had each week because no one kept count? Can you imagine a world where nobody exercised, but nobody was fat? Can you imagine a world where you had to marry certain types of women before you could have sex with them? Can you imagine when getting in a fight meant using your fists and not typing words onto a screen? Can you imagine a life without insect repellent? Can you imagine a world where there was no such thing as therapy or depression unless you were rich and it ran in the family? And if you couldn't handle reality, they put you in an institution. Have you figured out that shame keeps more people in line than any laws ever could? Do you think a car that needed fuel ever complained that gasoline didn't taste good? Do you understand what I'm saying? Can you believe we used to eat bologna and processed cheese and white bread wasn't an adjective or political statement? Did you know we didn't know what irony was? Did you know that not being able to change your oil or fix a flat tire or repair a leaky faucet meant you couldn't call yourself a man? Can you call yourself a man? Did you know no one used to be gay? But if you wore cologne, you were a queer. Can you imagine that armpit sweat and ring around the collar weren't embarrassing, but badges of honor? Do you understand that if skin cancer is the price you pay for not wearing sunscreen, so be it? Can you imagine a world where people didn't like, let alone trust, color TV? Did you know newspapers used to be delivered in the afternoon? Can you believe professional athletes in the 50s had to get second jobs to make ends meet? Did you realize there was no such thing as endangered species? Can you picture a world where priests were more respected than actors? Do you realize that there's never been any accountability for anything? Do you understand that's why people need to believe in God? Have you figured out that knowing everything doesn't mean anything? Did you know wearing a tie to the office wasn't optional, or that we used to be able to describe our jobs in one or two words? By the way, rich people have always been assholes. Get over it. Could you ever see yourself listening to 9 innings on a radio? Listening to a radio at all? Can you imagine a world where you canned food instead of freezing it? Did you know we used to enjoy movies with happy endings? Did you know that dogs, just like the people that own them, used to die because there was no money or options to prolong their lives? Can you believe people used to turn their underwear inside out to wear them a second time? Do you think all those fuckers on Wall Street got spanked as kids, or did they get put in timeout? Did you know the underclass used to go to college for free because it was called the military? Did you know I learned more from kicking someone's ass than I ever learned in school? Did you know I learned more from getting my ass kicked than anything else? Have you ever had your ass kicked? We know you've never kicked anyone else's ass. Do you understand what a toll it takes loving the things you don't want or even believe in? Do you understand if fathers talked about everything the way everyone wants them to, wives, children, and friends might like them more, but would never respect them? Are you aware this is the sacrifice required when you become a father? Do you know that we figured out how to be fathers and husbands and employees after we already had skin in the game? Do you understand this is why we despise your generation? Do you realize it's why we pity you too? Can we agree finally that if I've done my job as a man, as a father, I won't have to tell you any of these things?
So powerful.
Oh, thank you.
Powerful and so sad. So sad.
Yeah. So I write something like that. I read something like that. I smile inwardly. I cringe. I've heard that guy. We all know that guy or that amalgamation of guys. And I hope that crystallizes what I've been trying to articulate tonight, which is some of those attitudes are reprehensible and they're correctly in our collective past tense, all for the better. but there's an element of kind of wounded nobility and guys that were trying to do the best with what they had. That I think we make a mistake by considering all of them dinosaurs. It's the old saw, like, talk to an older person and learn about the world. I just think as writers and creatives, our radar maybe needs to be more attuned to the nuances so that we can then tell maybe more powerful stories with respect.
And it's interesting because it is a very powerful story. There's a sort of an underground tributary of self pity that runs through that narrative too. Thing like, and I think there's an envy of the younger, softer generation who didn't have to do the ass kicking, never got his ass kicked, blah blah blah, right? But at the same, and now has it easier and softer. But there's also a sort of Colonel Jessup, like hard jawed practicality to it too, saying
Yeah.
like, okay, if you want to be androgynous or you want to be pansexual or whatever, who is going to guard the wall? Like, who is going to guard the wall while you sleep, you little pansy, right? It's kind of like what I'm hearing in the
Yeah.
undertones of that. And I'm interested, Sean, because I know that you're a poet, and listening to this story, it strikes me that it could just as easily be a poem. Like it could be a prose poem. And in fact, I was picturing the words as you were reading them being like that. It could be like an Allen Ginsberg, prose poem about masculinity. Can you talk about the feeling, I guess, that you had writing this, what I would call a bullet story, which is a story that's written in one sitting, that's
Yeah.
deeply emotional. It seems to come through your head onto paper as opposed to like from you. Those have been my most successful stories, and usually are like the scenes around which books are written.
Yeah.
When you were writing this, did you feel it unscrolling like a prose poem or like a story or like somebody's voice? Like, talk to me about that.
Yeah, I mean, so it was definitely kind of a stream of consciousness. I don't think it was an intentional like list making type exercise, but it was and I'm honestly trying to remember. I know exactly where I was when I wrote it. I was at the Noepe Center at Martha's Vineyard, summer of 2016. And so, the election was hot and heavy, and I had been writing poetry all summer. So a lot of, for me personally, and maybe selfishly, I love that story just because even within the space I was at that summer, I was in a very poetic. So your question is very, prescient. I mean, maybe I had, a kind of a poetic sensibility, but this was the story that got me off a very firm poetic track, and I was kind of exercising some of that fictional muscle. But I do think it was channeling. Again, I won't speak for anybody else, but I mean, I'm, for better or worse, especially having grown up outside of DC, like I'm a political junkie. I can't quit it. I'm always reading. Like I'm part of it, all aspects of it. So for me, being caught up in 2015 and 16, I just think, now it's our default setting. Like we're checking Twitter and what did he do now or what's going on. But that was when I think we were still grappling with how is this clown show, and I mean the with a capital C, not just the he who should not be named, but like how is this not already fate? Like how is this not? Can we focus on more reasonable candidates or a candidate like the fact that this was getting leverage? I feel maybe that was fueling some of this. Like, are people coming to these rallies because there really is a crisis in masculinity? And if so, how out of touch are some of us, and what are we missing? And how are these Colonel Jessup attitudes? Like I've spent the last 20 years personally articulating why they're so outdated and why there's always a progression culturally, which is to the better. It's never quick enough. I think most of us would agree, especially, for our minority brothers and sisters and LBGQ community. Like it's never quick enough. But when we look over the long tail, like America figures it out slowly and steadily. But 2015, 16 seemed like this suspended, like, no, maybe we've had enough progress. And I think we're still grappling with how is this appealing? And again, for me, it's just so unsatisfying to say, yeah, because racism's baked in, misogyny's baked in, and that's 40% of our country. I mean, in terms of how people vote and talk, that seems true. But I think we need to, like I've been saying, if we look a little deeper, we might be able to better explicate, like, well, here's what the anger comes from, and here's how we might address it in a positive way.
I wonder. I'm going to ask our audience if they have any questions. And if you do have questions for us, our producer will pop them in the chat for Sean's, because we're coming up on the end of our hour already, amazingly. Although to me, not amazing, because I could talk to Sean for 16 hours and it would be like a minute. But anyway, if you do have any questions, we have time for one. I'm really fascinated by the sort of sense of optimistic activism present in your writing, to say like, well, we have to question, instead of just saying this is baked in, or this is, America is foundationally racist or foundationally misogynist. Like, of course it is, like, we know
Right.
this, we hold that
Right.
truth to be self-evident as well. It's just
Oh,
not
well done. Yeah.
and I think you're right that, at least for most of my lifetime and for years, there was the sense that we were slowly politically nosing the peanut forward and making progress with the Voting Rights Act and women's lib, as it was called when I was growing up. And now suddenly it has gotten rolled back. The peanut like rolled all the freaks way down the mountain. And it's like, what the hell is happening now?
Right.
And I feel as though everything is up in the air now. Like, somebody just took the whole can of nuts and threw it in the air, and where it's
Right.
going to land this year, nobody really knows. Talk to me about your sense of optimism, if you have one, and your sense of activism, because I know that you are somebody who isn't, as you said, like, you're a junkie, but you're not just doom scrolling. Like, you're out there
Right.
trying to actively change things. Talk about that intersectionality with this.
Sure. It's such a great question. Yeah, you're so awesome. I think the optimism comes from a genuine belief, and I again, as a writer type, I can't even get those words out without wanting to do this, but like a genuine sense that stories matter. We're storytelling creatures. I think storytelling creates empathy, it creates awareness, it enables people to understand a language, how they can tell their own stories in whatever format. So that's always all to the good. I just think this conversation, creation, sharing, all of these are good. I think when people are hoarding money or feelings, anger, whatever, resentment, that leads to implosions and bad things. So I'm genuinely bullish on the act of sharing. But I would say I'll reserve some criticism, for my team, and say, I know social media is its own little cocoon, but everyone in America needs to understand we've gotten kind of isolated and insular in our little cocoons of elitism, and it's very easy to point fingers and say, well, yeah, the rednecks are ruining everything, and if we just got people to wake up, we'd have a more progressive future. What kills me as a storyteller is when you have potential allies and they get shut down because they inadvertently say the wrong word. And I'm not talking about racist, sexist language, but I mean, if someone isn't saying, the right catchphrase or the generally agreed upon terminology, but they're trying, or their heart's in the right place, and they're publicly humiliated or looked down upon, we lose potential allies by not having a little bit bigger tent in our own sensibilities. I see this play out on Twitter, right? And it gives people the bullhorn to be holier than thou. And, people have to fight their own battles. And I don't really have I don't want to judge that. It just breaks my heart a little bit when I see the possibility for engagement. I'm just so congenitally opposed to zero sum game thinking. Like, no, you either are on the progressive side and these are the marching orders, or we don't want you here. That's how we lose elections, by, winning the popular vote, but the electoral like, we need all the allies we can get. You can't compromise your values. You shouldn't, especially women. Want women that are listening to hear me clearly and loudly. Do never compromise anything for toxicity or backwards thinking. But if you've got some dudes in your life that you think are winnable, try maybe a little harder to meet them halfway. And I think you'll see that if you talk to them and listen to them, you might win ardent advocates. And I think, as usual, I think about everything from Malcolm X to reform misogynists. Sometimes the best advocates in a cause are the people that see the light in their own way. They get it, and then they're all in. I want to see more of those conversions. I don't want to see people that are like, okay, I've got my list for 2024. I'm saying all the right words, because I think we all know that in 2 years, those words are going to be outdated. So personally, 100% for progress, full speed ahead, but let's try to have more meaningful and fluid dialogue so that we can get more people in our boat so that we really are, and forgive the cliche, I think I avoided cliches all night, but the rising tide does tend to lift all boats. What we're seeing for sure, in my humble opinion, over the last 40 years, the only people that have won are the haves who have continued to amass the land, the wealth, and the opportunity, and the have-nots continue to be fucked. So that's not working. So maybe it's time to be a little more versatile and nimble. And I think through story, we can start these kind of dialogues.
Mhm. All storytelling is an act of, all fiction is an act of imaginative empathy, because you're trying to get into the skin of somebody who's not like you, like the person who you are assuming the first person voice of in the story that you read. So I think using that sort of empathy to sort of cross the lines, as it were, is really important. I think about this a lot. I have one question of my own, and then we have an audience question that I
Okay.
will invite you toward the end. So my question is, this is like totally off script, but I think about this apropos of our conversation, and trying to reach people, which during the 2016 election, I was very bullish, and continue to be a sort of, social media activist, and also out there in the real world, and would engage people who I knew were voting for somebody I despised and thought was really dangerous, and say why, like explain, because I really wanted to reach people at an ideological level and a deeply felt emotional philosophical level, and in most cases was not successful. um, in this moment, I live in a brownstone in Boston that was built in 1860. We have 8 units in my building, and there's a guy who lives in the basement, and we call him Basement Guy. My dog walkers call him Basement Guy. And this guy, I'll just do a quick sketch of him for you. So he is a single dude. He's an Army veteran. He has been a career accountant, and now he's retired. And he had a 98-year-old mom he was taking care of, and she died. So he's all alone in the world, right? And every day when I come downstairs in our building's vestibule, he has left like um, anti-Biden, like Biden with Hitler mustaches, and like kill all the Democrats, and the Democrats are strangling the country, and like thank you President Trump, and a lot of MAGA stuff in the lobby. And I can reliably tell what my mood is. Like if I'm in a bad mood, I'm like, oh fuck this. If I'm in a decent mood, I just put it in the recycling. And if I'm in a bad mood, I tear it up and put it in the recycling. I have not gotten in his face because I think he's a lonely dude.
Yep.
And I also can't help thinking, if he weren't so lonely, would he stop embracing this hateful ideology that, I mean, and I'm not talking like, if any of you out there are MAGA watchers, I'm sorry, this is who I am. However, I'm not saying like that is the problem. I'm saying, although it is the problem, but
Yep.
also that like what he puts out is legit hateful. Like I'm half Jewish. I don't want to see Biden with a Hitler mustache on the table in my vestibule. How would you reach this guy who clearly is a sort of a tender soul who's now plugged into a rhetoric of hate?
God, I mean that. Ask me a hard question. Now, first of all, I'm sorry you have to deal with that. I think the blink reaction is, look, there's some people we're probably not going to reach. In my own life, in my own kind of how I roll, I guess I've always found that you can pretty quickly locate where someone's coming from by just listening to them. So I don't know if I would be effective, like approaching him and saying, "Hey, man, what are you really mad about?" But I would be like, one tactic I would take is I would say, "Man, what is it about Biden that is really pissing you off?" And if he said, "Yeah, because he's done X, Y, and Z," and I'd say, "It's funny because one of the things that's frustrated me about Democrats is they've been fighting for workers' rights and healthcare for decades, but they do such a lousy job of talking about it. We're not even aware of it." Validate the anger, especially my own thesis is a lot of this anger does stem from genuine sense of like, in America, we are chewed up and spit out. No one cares about us. If we're sick and we can't afford our medicine, no one's going to save the day. But try to understand, like, well, and what is it exactly that Trump or whomever is doing to address that? Well, they call it out. I think you can listen and not be disingenuous, but you can kind of try to locate the anger and
Mm.
point out that you all I would say I also am extremely frustrated. I think America is making some colossal mistakes, but here's how we're trying to address some of this. And I think if we had more women in power, we'd have different voices, or if we had people that weren't wealthy running the country, maybe different voices would be heard.
Mm.
I would talk about the time that I visited West Virginia with a friend and saw closed down coal mines and thought there was no plan in place to help these communities that close down. I don't know. I mean, to me, it always comes back to story, but
Mhm.
I am not overly optimistic. And I will tell you that when I see someone holding, hate sign, or I see someone on social media, my inclination is to keep driving because we're all busy and, we have to do the best we can. But on a one-on-one level, I guess I've always found that confrontation usually is a preordained conclusion, but being there to listen, I think can take people off their guard. I think a lot of these angry men are expecting to be shut down and critiqued, so they're already on the defensive. If you can somehow disarm them, it can be genuinely humbling.
Yeah, that's interesting. Thank you for that perspective. I always think listening is a very underrated. Like Hemingway, ironically, Hemingway, one of the most, macho figures we have in the last century,
Yeah.
said nobody really listens. People don't know how to listen, and I always liked that quote. So maybe I'll try that with Basement Guy. We'll see. And I would be curious to know like what is the source of this, because I think it can come from a lot of places. The source of this disenchantment, I guess I would say.
Yeah.
Okay, so our question from the audience, I know we have a lot of comments. This is our question is, Sean, if you were a monarch, what would you do right now? And by the way, my gut was king, not monarch, and that's from Mason Miller.
If I was king,
You're
we'd have a lot more problems than we already have in America. If I was the king.
We'd be too
Uh,
happy. We'd be too happy. We'd all be holding hands all the time.
yeah, well, I mean, it would be, free books for everyone. I think the one that we what I think about when I think about the big picture is it's always about storytelling. I think, I'm always, both frustrated and bemused by the fact that there's a certain sector of our society that worships a historical figure religiously and somehow doesn't do any of the things that he prescribed to do in terms of loving one's neighbor and being humble and being kind and so forth. We talk about the golden rule, and for some reason that never applies. So I think if I had the power of the so-called bully pulpit, I would want to bring in more storytellers as opposed to consultants to talk about the communities that they live in and show how Joe from the diner in Iowa has a lot more in common from our buddy in Boston, and perhaps a professor who's a second generation immigrant. There's probably some real interesting connecting threads in terms of what their parents wanted for them, what they wanted for themselves, and what our society has not allowed them to achieve. Then we start talking about how to use our words better, and how to use words, period. Again, I'll double down on, I do have a tremendous sympathy for men or women who are at a certain point in their lives and are just not able to articulate their pain or their frustration because they don't know how to. I wouldn't trade places with someone like that for anything. Um, Teaching people that to be able to talk, to have the courage to talk, and have people that are willing to listen. How can we go wrong if we're willing to agree we have to do that?
Mhm. Mm. I
And
think
and no, and puppies. What, Jenna? What would you and I do if I was king? Like, I mean, puppies have to somehow free treats for all puppies forever.
I think I'd put all the puppies in a giant pen in the Dakotas and let them just bash around on each other and, throw lots of milk bones in there every day and watch the ensuing zoomies. And that would be if I were the king of the forest, there would be zoomies every day, like just massive puppy zoomie.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
I think you should run for president. I'll be your VP, or you can run for king. And I'll be in the court. I'll be the court jester until it comes.
I think we writers are made to be court jesters. Maybe the plot twist is you somehow become the king or queen, but I think you and I are very comfortable in that court jester space where we get to sample the wine and the food and let the pomp and circumstance, like, let that all go on, and we'll be behind the scenes kind of telling our stories and playing with the puppies.
Totally. I love my hat with the little jingly bells. My friend Mark called me Falstaff the other night, and I was like, wait, oh, okay, I'll take that. So that's my new alter ego. Sean, what before we let you go, would you like to tell your readers about this kind of man? Like what would you like to say to your readers?
Well, I mean, and anyone that's inclined to check it out, very sincerely, thank you. Thank you for being here tonight, listening, or if you watch this recording later. Um, you can make the world a little bit better. Never mind my book. Go out and support artists and creators of any kind, especially your music. People that are making this amazing music that makes life worth living. The mechanisms of them getting paid are increasingly tenuous. Buy their album, buy their CD, support them. If you want to help me, you can go on Amazon. You can pre-order the book. It comes out on May 7th. Believe it or not, reviews matter. Leave a review, encourage your friends to leave a review. And even for our artistic community, one of my, mantras is I think even we sensitive artists get caught up in the scarcity model and not wanting to celebrate. I think if we all celebrate each other's achievements, we're making a difference in the world, and it can help someone else out. So I look at the occasion of my book coming out as a continuum of the world that I support and live in. I would be nowhere without my fellow artists. So support artists, shout it from the rooftops, and use some of that energy. I think we've got a lot of nervous anxiety. I know I do right now with things going on in the world. I think it's very healthy to turn that into a celebration of the people that are on this earth trying to make the world more beautiful. Support that, and I think we're on the right path to reclaiming some of our humanity.
All right, you heard that. And that's the kind of heart that is in this kind of man. Can you show us your beautiful book again?
I certainly will.
Thank you. I love this book. Everybody go. Is it on Bookshop also?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so don't forget to buy it on Bookshop and on Amazon. Buy at least 5 copies at each venue. If you buy it on Bookshop, you're supporting the indies. If you buy it on Amazon, you're supporting people like me who buy all my like medicine and soap and stuff from Amazon. So that works too. On. Love you so much, brother. I'm so proud of you. Thank you for bringing this thought-provoking, delicate, tensile conversation about masculinity into the world at a time when we need it the most.
Well, Jenna, as I told you at the outset, there's literally no one else I'd rather be in conversation with about virtually any topic.
Mhm.
We didn't even get into like the Red Sox and Boston and the dogs, but as I said, I'm happy to repeat you're one of my genuine heroes. I love that you walk the walk. I mean, you're a brilliant writer, and so you do the work. That's its own unbelievable reward for us. But you put it out there. You show up for writers. You show up for the community. I'm so honored to have you here talking to you. And I always end our conversations the same way, to be continued, because we never exhaust the topics. I'm just very grateful for that. I adore you, and I'm so appreciative.
Brother, just getting started.
All right, everybody, thanks for checking us out. This will be posted on all the socials. Be well, be kind, and we'll see you soon.